Amazing Grace by Right by Faith. Chapter 2. Home is where the ice cream is. Jeremy and Grace sat in the back seat of the Benper family car, enjoying the luxury of traveling in an automobile. This is not to say the prospect of vehicular transportation was considered something reserved for the wealthy in Johto, only that Twinsport was a walking town in every sense of the phrase. Cars were merely an impracticality. If one wanted, they could travel from the town's northern to southern limits on foot in less than 30 minutes. Far more common than cars and trucks were bicycles and mopeds. They could be spotted almost anywhere, and almost everybody owned one. Because of the condition of Jeremy and their newest family member, or pet depending on who you asked, Rosa and John decided it would be best if they drove home from the hospital. It was an uneventful ride in the old blue Benper family car, but those were arguably the best kind. Ocean-scented air flowed freely through the rolled-down windows, bringing a sense of freedom to the otherwise cramped confines of the automobile. The radio's volume was set on a low level, creating just enough ambient noise to avoid an uncomfortable silence between the young backseat passengers and the adults in the front. Jeremy watched as house after house passed by his window, observing the townspeople as he did so. A strange feeling came over the child as he gazed out the window, as though a set of eyes were watching him. The boy looked over at Grace and saw her large, crimson eyes staring inquisitively up at him. Raising an eyebrow, Jeremy asked, "What is it, Grace?" The Pokemon scooted closer to the boy and reached up towards his head in a somewhat needy fashion. Confused, Jeremy tilted his head as a show of his lack of understanding, hoping that such a gesture was universal. Persistently, however, the Ralts continued to reach for the boy's head, almost desperately. A slight understanding of what the Pokemon wanted dawned on Jeremy, prompting the boy to slowly ask, "You want to see my head?" He raised his right arm hesitantly and pointed to his temple. Seeming to understand what Jeremy asked, or the gesture of the pointing, the Ralts eagerly nodded and continued to reach towards the boy next to her. Curious as to what Grace wanted with his head, Jeremy decided to yield to the Pokemon's request and lowered himself to the creature's eye level. Grace reached out with both of her petite arms, the left of which had several layers of pink bandages and covered the bite wound left by the Rattata, and firmly planted her hands on Jeremy's forehead. The boy felt as Grace's tiny fingers separated and tenderly pressed into his skin. Jeremy never expected what happened next. An overwhelming sensation of joy permeated through the boy's body. The feeling was just like yesterday when he pulled Grace into a hug in an effort to warm her shivering form inside the dank, dark cave they'd used for shelter. Joy and happiness in its purest form flowed through him like water through a roaring river, intense and powerful. Yet, despite the intensity, it was calming, comforting, and quite unlike anything he'd ever experienced before, bearing, of course, the similar happening the previous night. What seemed like minutes passed in seconds as the mind-numbing sensation continued to penetrate his being. Just as Jeremy began to lose himself in the feeling, Grace removed her hands from his head and lowered her arms to her side. In that instant, the sensation began to fade. Jeremy violently shook his head, trying to comprehend what had just happened. What was that? Looking down at Grace, the boy noticed the small Pokemon's petite mouth curled upwards in a broad smile. Opening his mouth, Jeremy found himself unable to speak, let alone form a word. His mind was an incoherent mess of thoughts and emotions, all fighting to regain their proper place. The chaos was alien, yet blissfully wonderful all at the same time. Several moments passed before Jeremy managed to calm his mind enough to regain a semblance of coherency. "Was that you?" the boy asked in disbelief, causing his mother to turn around in her seat to look back at her son. "What was that, Jeremy?" Rosa inquired, unable to hear what he'd said. She had assumed he was talking to either her or her husband. The boy hesitantly tore his gaze away from the smiling Ralts and towards his parent in the front of the car. Realizing his mother thought he was talking to her, Jeremy shook his head and politely dismissed her question. Nothing. I was just thinking out loud," Jeremy lied. Rosa looked at her son, then shifted her gaze to the seemingly gleeful Pokemon next to him. She wasn't ignorant and knew something was up between the two, but didn't know what had transpired between them. Raising her eyebrow in a very mother-like fashion, Rosa looked suspiciously at Jeremy before humming an "okay" and turning back around to face forward. She knew she wouldn't get an answer, even if she threatened to reprimand him. It's not like he'd done anything wrong in the first place, as far as she knew. Jeremy sighed a little in relief. It would have been a strange thing to explain to his parents. Turning his attention back to Grace, he began to wonder about the Pokemon and her abilities. She had seemed to directly convey her emotion of joy to him simply through touch. Jeremy had little doubt that this was what had happened just moments before. The emotion was incredible. He knew what it was, yet it was foreign to his body. It was joy, but it wasn't his joy. What a strange attribute. Jeremy had to wonder just what type of Pokemon this Ralts was, and what other abilities it had. These thoughts were interrupted when the boy felt the car come to a halt, making him lean slightly forward in his seatbelt. Looking around, Jeremy saw they'd arrived at their destination. Never before had the boy been quite as happy to rest his eyes on the small, white house that he knew as home. Its bright red roofing and matching window shutters seemed as though they were welcoming him, inviting Jeremy to come inside. Opening his car door, the boy stepped out of the vehicle and was followed shortly thereafter by Grace. The front door of the house, which matched the roofing shingles and window shutters in color, opened, revealing a blonde girl who appeared to be in her mid-teens. She wasted no time in expressing her relief upon seeing Jeremy. "Jeremy! I'm so happy you're okay!" The teenage girl ran through the doorway and down the cobblestone path that connected the house to the driveway and embraced Jeremy in a hug. She moved quicker than he thought was possible. She seemed overjoyed to see he was indeed okay. "Do you know how worried you made everybody, you little squirt?" Jeremy's mother stepped out of the car and watched the scene unfold. "Hello, Ashley. We're so thankful you were able to babysit Claire and David. John and I both wanted to be at the hospital. I can't even begin to tell you how glad we were when you were able to come over on such short notice," Rosa said with a warm smile as she approached the girl and her son, still trapped in the teen's embrace. Ashley released Jeremy from her vice-like hug and promptly stood to speak with the adults. "It really wasn't a problem, Ms. Benper. During the summer months, I don't have much to do, and I'm always happy to watch Claire and David." The girl turned her attention back to the child in front of her. To Ashley's surprise, she saw a green and white Pokemon walk up and stop by Jeremy's side. Its small form seemed to hug the young boy's leg as it attempted to hide itself. As far as Ashley knew, the Benper family didn't own any Pokemon, neither to battle nor as a pet. Some families acquired Pokemon to help around the house, but the small creature next to Jeremy didn't seem fit for such a task. Kneeling down to get a better view of the petite Pokemon, Ashley tilted her head and smiled in a friendly manner while she asked, "And who are you?" "Her name's Grace. I saved her yesterday," Jeremy answered in the Ralts' stead, his voice laced with beaming pride. The girl seemed genuinely surprised by the statement and watched as the small creature inched closer to the boy, as though to further hide herself from view, not unlike how a shy child would act. Ashley giggled at the act and moved back slightly as a show of understanding. "Is that so? You'll have to tell me all about it then," the teen smiled in response. Ashley was a kind girl who'd lived several houses down from the Benper family. She had acted like an older sister to Jeremy as he grew up, including him in her life when she could. John and Rosa were thankful for this. The girl had been like a sibling to their boy, who, up until recently, had been an only child. He would often get lonely when his friends couldn't play, but Ashley made a point of playing with the child during those times. It's not like she was obligated to do so, it was just in her character.